You headed back to DC after this?
Huh?
You headed back to DC after this?
I absolutely am. To the extent that normally I've been in and out and in and out.
We're gonna start right at 9:40. We'll let the online people know.
The airlines and the non-profits. Thank you so much.
Anybody have evaluations ready for me?
Oh, I want to. But you didn't. And I just wanted more of that. And then,
How about you? Would you like some?
but that was the right decision. And I'm not trying to be anti. But I need,
Oh, I said, I know.
but right now, I mean, that's what I want to even know what that was. It was that. And have you?
Yeah.
How you doing?
Okay. She's a fellow.
Oh, okay, got it.
You do early childhood.
You said that was Mark Washington. Okay, great. Yeah, Jackson. Sorry, Jackson said.
Yeah.
Got it.
So she.
Oh, great. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
And
Very
you're-
much involved.
You're a fellow there. Are you
It's early
doing your homework or working doing some type of outreach?
No, so I do my own work. There's hopefully to finish a book project.
Oh, okay. That is related to, you said early childhood education or is it collection?
No, not at all. So
Well,
it looks at the intellectual biography of someone who worked with Head Start, English Jolie. She worked with Head Start in Sesame Street. So I look at her just intellectual biography, but also me her being that way. So
Yeah, that'll do
Yeah,
it.
she's from.
Did you
actually,
go?
no.
Okay.
No, so she's from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but she worked with Crystal Sandler on CDGM.
Yeah.
I look at the second one after. Yeah, yeah, she'll should be here next week.
Oh, okay. I was asking you all might work together on it.
No, I saw her when I was doing some research on Amory. Like, she knows my work.
Yeah. Oh, where were you at?
Johns Hopkins.
Oh, that's good. Who did you work with?
Jessica Marie Johnson.
Oh, okay. That's good.
And Martha Johnson.
Okay,
Yeah, they're yeah. So I've been here for about a year and a half, and then I'm done in June. Everyone's like, where are you going? Everyone wants me to stay here. I'm like, I don't know. I'm not ready so far.
Oh, okay.
North Carolina.
Later. You got that breakfast?
Daddy, you know you're trying to start at 9:40.
Okay, yeah, I'm from Rayford.
I'm gonna put something in my
But
mouth.
you're gonna bring it in here, though, right? Please bring it in here.
Yes.
But I can bring it for you.
Okay, so I live an hour and a half south.
Outside of there.
No, I mean, I see.
I live an hour and a half south.
Got it.
But it's only one that's one that can hang. It's only one that's hanging. So no,
People which are working into like history and like education programs or.
Largely, so I do a lot of history, public history work.
Okay.
So, like I do a lot of community archiving in Jackson
Oh, okay.
as well. So I work with a civil rights veteran. She has like a collection. Everybody wants 1,000 boxes. Just helping her process those. So I do like a lot of
Processing them like in her home or processing them like is she interested in being part of it? She wants to keep it?
No, she wants to keep it community based. Because she came here during the 60s, so during the state archives don't get along very well. Because at one point they were going to throw away like all the papers. So she's really fearful of like what the government could happen to the collection. And she doesn't run it at any state institution.
It's very early days.
Two would be ideal, but their archive is at the state and they don't have the library. someone was interested in taking it to West College, but they're saying students to run it. And then Jackson State also is student.
Where's Karen? Is she,
You want me to come over there?
She wants it to stay in the city.
Okay.
Oh, so Sigler is not happy with her either. Because she has like 3 summer applications, the original one. She got educational records with Head Start. It's almost like with the, she has Coco SNCC records. When the organization shut down, she went in at night and the 12 trash cans because they were on yeah, so that's why a lot of people want to stay the fashion.
Past master said, can't eat, but I
No,
but I still have.
Because this team and private collection. As far as, yeah.
Okay now,
So that did it not,
you know, you've already
there was
claimed
one
for
sort
the
of
organization.
organization created related to, like, sort of like,
So she has the nonprofit that is under, but they still would like to see it. So we did a big one. Yes. They're like, yeah.
I feel like some places was trying to be flexible that were like it's a partnership between the community organizations. There can be like Spencer, maybe like Spencer Foundation, but not.
I tried to clear, we're doing going for the clear event collection. I think they'll do that.
They, but they
I wish I
Yeah, so they want to see partners. I had to let go of the status ones because they got complicated with them and funding and grants because they lost one member. I didn't get it for 3 months.
Okay.
Research assistants. Yeah, my research assistants, they're getting paid like crazy. That's Bob. I mean, they love it.
yeah, it's like, but that's.
They have a fork or something. Oh, yeah.
Because it comes from Rose College, they have to close up.
Be close, so remember I got that. Oh, I'm sitting right here.
You see the folder up here? I got the folder yesterday.
I know, but that's what you said, but
You must have gotten mixed up out here somewhere.
be careful.
Yeah.
He does the
Well, I'll look later. But I didn't need to be leaving it around.
I'm sorry, I can't see. Oh, I saw that you said that. So what are you trying to, okay, so,
Said hi or something.
no, he said it was,
Now, so he'll be directing.
okay, so, wait, no, I'm just testing this. Is it really hot? If I'm standing like this?
You said hot?
Yeah. Hot. The mic is like hot.
Oh, no.
That's, I mean, hot as far as the sound. Yeah.
I didn't, is it on?
Yeah, she's a plan. It goes to it's like a 5-person. Yes.
I'm glad to see you, because yesterday we needed you.
They told me your dog was okay yesterday.
Right now, I'm trying to process it, create a finding.
Even dealing with too much air. So I'm going to take.
I have my own funders that right now do it. Maybe go so I asked them for this week.
We have to just, okay. Going to dinner. Hey, I
I'm winging it.
You're what?
I'm winging it. I didn't have time to write any stuff.
You're gonna do fine.
Okay. But there are people who just
Channel your inner Dr. Mac.
Can I give you my number in case
You want to go mow the lawn?
it wasn't very nice. I wasn't feeling good.
Now, do you know how to turn all this stuff on? Careful.
So life code is more of an umbrella.
So, he finished. The mic is what you're going to do. We finished.
Her work itself.
What do you mean? Finish.
Halting what you're going to
Yeah,
do.
unless you have something to add.
I don't even know where we at. Well,
So anything that's here this night? That's what we always say.
Well, I've got a clip on the desktop and computer. We moved it over yesterday, so I just need some help getting to it.
That's why it's like.
And I asked him, the dude from the come down.
She's presented with chapters, yeah. Yeah. So that's like it's from the but she's actually
directress said she's a star.
Yeah, just be really careful of that.
Yeah, let me go around this way.
Yeah, it's like, what comes out in the spring break?
Maybe somewhere out there in the box with the program. You have a program?
No, I don't.
yeah, it seems good. Yeah, I was telling her.
David, you have a program? We're gonna work on that, okay?
So I started a college for archival library project program, history. So the promise is that I'm going to do more stuff.
I do have to.
You ready?
Yeah, I have a student who's actually always trying to figure out. So, like
Hey. No, why is that so high?
Oh, that's because you don't have.
For you?
But it's very. You can hear.
Well, I mean, all I'm gonna say is what needs to be said. So it's okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. You hear it back there, Leo?
yes.
Okay. Hey, Pat.
Yes.
Especially because there's no direct flights.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We want to get underway today, this morning. And okay, good morning again to those of you who are here in Vicksburg and those of you who are live streaming. This is the second and the final day of our symposium. Yesterday was quite exciting and quite a wonderful day, and hopefully all of you that were involved learned something about Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister. And so we're going to continue that path, beginning today with a keynote address from Dr. Jarvis Givens, and in a moment I'm going to turn you over to our moderator, Karen Kendall, who will introduce all of this. But we will move through the program in that way. I will just say that the film screening last night of David Morris's documentary on Jane McAllister was absolutely amazing. So, where's David? So kudos to David, because, you know, we all learned a lot, even I did, and I thought I knew a lot about her, but it was wonderful. So, having said that, I will now turn you over to Karen.
Okay, so make sure that I don't repeat anything that Miss Betty said. But I do have to say good morning. Good morning. And yeah, welcome back. Or there may be some people here for the first time, so welcome. This is the name of this symposium is The Cultural Environment, a Window on the World. Yesterday was an extraordinary day. I also learned a lot, and I cried, and I laughed, and I just believe that it ended on such a high note, and it felt like there was a community that was just kind of created right here in this room. So we're going to continue with that, because I think that today's sessions are going to be very, well, actually we have a keynote address, and then we have a session. So yes, I'm very excited to learn more, because I am a lifelong learner. So I'm going to give biographies that are kind of brief-ish. So if you want to learn more about the presenter, the panelists, the detailed bios are in your programs. At the end of the keynote address, there will be a question and answer period, and then that's it. That's all I'm going to say right now. Okay, so I would like to introduce our keynote address presenter. So I'm going to read this. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jarvis Givens, a professor at the Graduate School of Education and the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He's a oh, wait, did I get this right? Co-directs the Black Teacher Archive, right? A groundbreaking initiative he helped launch. Dr. Givens is rebirthing our academic heritage with the publishing of his book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black art. Is that it? The Art of Black Teaching. I didn't put it all in, so forgive me. The Art of Black Teaching. So today he will share his insights on the cultural significance of Dr. McAllister's scholarship, and we are honored to have him here with us. Thank you, Dr. Peterson. I'm sorry, I got that wrong.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Very excited to be here. Thank you, Dr. Spencer. I'm going to pull up these slides. All right. Oh, I was wondering with the text that's at the bottom there, is it possible for us to, do we know why the closed caption is happening, or is that supposed to be?
Oh.
Whatever you say. Recording you.
Okay, maybe that fixed it? There we go. All right, I've never seen that before. Good morning. All right, so I'm really excited to be here. I was very grateful when I got the invitation from Dr. Gardner to be a part of this conversation commemorating the life of Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister, who represents an intellectual tradition that I'm becoming increasingly more invested in, and for various reasons. I should just say, my trajectory coming to the work of studying the history of African American education began with me earning my doctorate degree in African American Studies from UC Berkeley. But since leaving graduate school, I've been on the faculty at a graduate school of education at Harvard for the past 8 years now. And I've been in that process, working and supporting the development of scholars who are thinking critically at the intersection of Black life and important questions in education. Support these students in developing their own intellectual identities in relationship to a much longer tradition. And I've come to find out that there's a very strong and robust intellectual tradition among Black scholars of education that has been underappreciated both in the field of education research, but I would also say in the field of African American studies. And I think that some of the work that's being done here to unearth the legacy and the significance of Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister, her leadership, but also her scholarship, I think is a part of helping us to see that story. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be doing some work placing the significance of Dr. McAllister in a broader context of what I would think about as the Black education professoriate. And hopefully that will become clear about why I think framing and defining this particular group of intellectuals in this way is significant. But I want to start with just a kind of very brief scenario that places Dr. McAllister within the broader world of Black teachers that I'm always interested in talking about, not just Black educators in higher education, but Black school teachers during the Jim Crow era more broadly, which is in many ways, for the most part, what most of my scholarship up until this point has been focused on. So on December 4th, 1953, Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister spoke to an audience of more than 300 teachers and educators and education scholars at the annual meeting of the Mississippi Teachers Association's 4th District. McAllister was the keynote speaker for the conference, which assembled under the theme of Education Faces the Challenge of Change. This was 5 months before the landmark ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education. However, even before the case was decided on May 17, 1954, Black teachers and scholars of education around the country discussed what desegregation might mean for their communities. They collectively deliberated about the future of their jobs, what might be gained and lost for their students, and they discussed their hopes for educational justice, which they had so long been fighting for. Scholars like Dr. McAllister, a member of the Black intellectual elite whose scholarship and activism was closely associated with rank-and-file Black teachers, helped provide visionary leadership to African American educators as they faced the challenges before them in Jim Crow schools. Whether they worked in urban communities or rural environments,
or whether they taught in one-room schools or historically black colleges and universities. Anticipating turbulent times ahead, Dr. McAllister spoke to the 300 black teachers before her, and she imparted sage wisdom. Looking out into the audience, clear-eyed and full-throated, she offered the following perspective. Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity. Have courage to endure humility for the worth of the destination. Professor McAllister was no stranger to the All-Black African American Teachers Association. She had long been a recognized leader in the world of Colored Teachers Association, particularly in the states of Louisiana, Tennessee, and Mississippi, as well as within the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools. These professional organizations formed a networked world, one where black school teachers interacted and collaborated with the black intellectual elite, especially a distinct group of scholars whom I will refer to as the Black Education Professoriate. One of my primary goals for today is to situate Jane Ellen McAllister as a pioneer among this distinct community of scholars, given her achievement as the first African American woman to earn a doctorate in education in 1928. But to appreciate the cultural and political significance of Dr. McAllister's scholarship requires that we also take stock of the broader professional landscape in which she labored, both as an academic and a leader among teachers. So my charge today is threefold. First, I want to provide more context about the Black Education Professoriate, to offer some definition to the achievement of Dr. McAllister's scholarship. My second task is to provide context about the political significance of black teachers during the Jim Crow era, paying particular attention to these professionals as an organized body of political actors. They were educators, but they were also very, very important political actors within the broader context of the black freedom struggle. And finally, in doing that, I want to offer some in these comments, details about Dr. McAllister's leadership among black teachers in segregated schools and what it demonstrates about the close coordination between black scholars of education and African American school teachers, a historical partnership that has been greatly underappreciated. So part one, defining the Black Education Professoriate. The life and work of Jane Ellen McAllister points to a submerged history in African American studies, education studies, and the history of education. It points to the overlooked contributions made by the Black Education Professoriate to the African American intellectual tradition and the national educational landscape. In an unpublished report from 1984, the historian James Anderson's defined the Black Education Professoriate as follows: as Afro-American doctorates whose formal academic preparation was in the field of education and who held professorships, administrative or research positions in education. And then he goes on and continues that he makes some exceptions are made, for a number of early black professors who did graduate study in pedagogy prior to the development of doctoral programs in education, which is something that doesn't necessarily take place until the third decade of the 20th century. Professor Anderson offers that there's this group of folks, even as they didn't have degrees in education, whose main careers were directed towards teaching, research, and administration in the field of education, right? And so what I'm saying is that to appreciate Dr. McAllister's contributions requires that we have some understanding of this very distinct group of scholars to which she belonged. So, to chart the origins of the Black Education Professoriate, we must turn our attention to Howard University, and specifically to the career of Professor Lewis Baxter Moore. Professor Moore was an 1889 graduate of Fisk University, and he earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania. becoming the first African American to receive a doctorate from University of Pennsylvania, but also before he helped found the American Negro Academy in 1897. Professor Moore was the 5th African American awarded a doctoral degree by an American institution, and while a graduate student, he took courses in pedagogy. And also, while studying abroad, he investigated educational systems in Germany and in England. And Professor Moore taught at Howard University as a professor of philosophy and education, and in 1899 he became the very first dean of Teachers College at Howard, having been largely responsible for its development. The Teachers College at Howard University was the first in the history of black education. And at the time of its creation, Professor Moore was still the first and only black professor of education at any American university. And while the origins of the black education professoriate begin with Professor Lewis Baxter Moore at Howard, part of its beginnings also leads directly to the sons and daughters of the state of Mississippi. This is part of why we're here gathered today, right? Because Jane Ellen McAllister was the first African American to receive a doctorate in education from Columbia University's Teachers College when she earned her degree in 1928 after completing her dissertation on the training of Negro teachers in Louisiana. And with the successful completion of her dissertation, Dr. McAllister also became the first black woman to earn a doctorate in education from any university. And in doing so, she was following in the footsteps of another trailblazer from the state of Mississippi. Just 3 years prior, in 1925, Charles Henry Thompson, a son of Jackson, Mississippi, became the very first African American to earn a doctorate in education. Thompson earned a doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Chicago in 1925, and he later founded the Journal of Negro Education in 1932 while teaching at Howard University, establishing it as the premier research journal on all matters related to education and black life. And it should come as no surprise that in the very first issue, Volume 1, Issue 1 of Thompson's Journal of Negro Education is included a review of Dr. McAllister's dissertation in an article entitled Current Literature on Negro Education. Professors McAllister and Thompson's academic achievements marked the beginning of a new era of the black education professoriate. By the 1930s, education quickly became the primary field in which African Americans earned doctoral degrees. As historian James Anderson explains, the growth of the Afro-American professoriate was due in part to the increased demand for education professors in black colleges, and in large measure to the funding of black graduate study by two northern philanthropic foundations. And this is the General Education Board and the Julius Rosenwald Fund, which offered these new fellowship programs, particularly for black students to attain graduate degrees, right? And part of it has to do with these efforts to elevate the status of HBCUs, in part because HBCUs were seeking accreditation. And so it required the elevation of the faculty teaching at these schools. These white philanthropists, and surely with some urging from black leadership at HBCUs and scholars themselves, intentionally funded education over other fields of studies, right? And that's a separate conversation that requires some nuance. But they did this insisting that this would improve the teaching at HBCUs, which at this time we all know were primarily involved with the training of teachers. And they also insisted that in raising the academic profile of HBCU faculty would help these institutions achieve accreditation. These two fellowship programs completely changed the landscape of the black professoriate, not just in education, but more broadly. But I'm saying that especially in the field of education because there was an outsized representation of black folks pursuing doctorate degrees in this particular field, in part because this is what was being prioritized also by these foundations. And the numbers tell this story, right? And so I just want to give some context for us to understand what this growth looked like. So while there were only 31 African Americans with a doctoral degree in any field right, before 1925, 46 earned doctoral degrees in education during the 1930s alone, right? And then of approximately 620 doctorates earned by African Americans between 1876 and the year 1951, at least 261 were in the field of education, right? So this means that approximately 42% of all African American doctorates were earned in the field of education by 1951, right? And this is what I'm saying, that this is a very particular group of black scholars that Charles Thompson and Jane Ellen McAllister are the very first kind of scholars in this particular field that's taking shape, beginning in the 1920s, but that really accelerates in the 1930s and changes the landscape of the kind of black professoriate, but also forms this very distinct group within the field of education research. And I think, unsurprisingly, as we would expect, the African American scholars who earned degrees in education were principally concerned with studying and solving critical problems at the intersection of education and black social life, right? And this is evidence when we kind of take a passing review at the kind of a bibliography that's formed of all of the dissertations by black scholars who earned doctoral degrees, and we can look at the abstracts and the information about the dissertations that they wrote. So this is evidenced by the fact that of the 261 dissertations produced between 1925 and 1951, 206 focused on education in the black community or treated some specific aspect of black life and culture. In Jane McAllister's 1928 dissertation on the distinct challenges facing black teachers in their pursuit of excellence in the profession was indeed a pioneering study in this regard, because it helped lay the foundation for a much more expansive intellectual tradition of what I have come to call black education studies, right? So we might think about the history of black studies, but what I'm saying is that these scholars working at the intersection of black studies and education studies are really laid the groundwork for a kind of distinct body of scholarship that has yet to be fully appreciated, whether it be in the field of education research or in African American studies. And I'm saying that as someone with the PhD in African American studies. In her study, The Training of Negro Teachers in Louisiana, Professor McAllister provided an in-depth analysis of the work conditions experienced by African American educators in Louisiana. But it was also quite representative of working conditions experienced by black teachers across the southern states. McAllister showed that black youth in Louisiana attended school for approximately 112 days out of the year, which was significantly less than the average number of school days for white students, and that they were more often than not taught by inexperienced teachers. And in saying this, I think it's very, very important to note that Professor McAllister's assessment was an indictment of the conditions faced by black teachers, not to be confused with an assessment of black teachers' capacity, their commitment, or their professional aspirations. And this is something that becomes very important when we see distinctions between these studies by black scholars during the period and their white contemporaries who are also writing in very degrading ways about black education and black teachers. It's one thing to talk about the structural challenges, which is what Jane McAllister is documenting, as opposed to locating the problem within the people themselves. Hopefully y'all understand what I mean by that. And so, for instance, in Professor McAllister's dissertation, she tracked how black teachers in Louisiana were forced to move frequently from place to place while receiving miserably low salaries. McAllister documented that the average annual salary for Negro teachers in the elementary school was $487, and in the high schools, $825. And comparatively, she shows that white teachers in Louisiana received $869 in elementary schools and $1,366 in the high schools, right? So we can see the kind of the great disparity that she's documenting in this kind of qualitative data and in some sense quantitative data that she's amassing to tell the story about the landscape that black teachers are navigating. And so scholars in the black education professoriate coming behind Professors Thompson and McAllister continued in this heroic tradition. They were intentionally producing scholarship that was descriptive, corrective, and prescriptive. They worked to describe dynamics in the social life of Black education with as much clarity and nuance as possible. They sought to correct racist ideas about Black people, which were taken for granted and used as the basis of educational policy and practice. And more importantly, they prescribed carefully developed remedies to transform African Americans' experiences in schools, motivated by a broader commitment to educational justice. For instance, some of the scholars that will come after Professors Thompson and McAllister are people like Howard H. Long, who refuted racist arguments based on IQ tests, setting a very important precedent and propelling him to become the first African American to receive a doctorate in education at Harvard University in 1933. Horace Mann Bond's 1936 dissertation entitled Social and Economic Influences on the Public Education of Negroes in Alabama, 1865 to 1930, is a stellar model of interdisciplinary scholarship in education, a melding of Bond's interest in educational history and his long-standing interest in the relationship between social environment and academic achievement. But there were also the works of Black women scholars, like Mary E. Carpenter's 1941 dissertation entitled The Treatment of the Negro in American High School Textbooks, which anticipated key issues raised by African American students demanding Black studies in the 1960s, right? When you read Carpenter's dissertation, you can almost imagine that she may have been writing this during the period of the kind of Black student movement in higher education in the late 1960s that leads to the institutional development of Black studies. But obviously we know that there are other scholars, whether it be Lila Amos Pendleton and Mary McLeod Bethune and Woodson and all these other folks who are invested in this, in the early Black history movement or the early Negro history movement well before the Black studies programs are established in mainstream American universities. So what I'm saying here is that the scholarship produced by the Black education professoriate of the Jim Crow era amounts to a submerged intellectual history, not only in the field of education research, but also in the field of Black studies. And yet I would offer that the lack of appreciation for the contributions of the Black education professoriate reflects the broader, peculiar silence that has persisted so long about the cultural and political significance of Black schools and educators prior to desegregation in general, right? And so this is now what I want to turn to for the other comments that I have in thinking about the broader landscape, not just in terms of those who earn doctoral degrees, but in terms of Black educators who are in community with people like Thompson and McAllister, right? To appreciate the intellectual life and the impact that these ideas they produce were having by people who were putting them into practice on the ground. So the remainder of my comments I'll title The Fugitive Life of Black Teaching, which is really me working to kind of merge some of what I've said before about this Black education professoriate with the kind of previous work I've done up until this point about the kind of subversive political and intellectual legacy of Black school teachers and the intellectual elite that they partner with, right? Scholars who were in HBCUs in higher education producing scholarship that they were taking up. So my previous comments situating Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister within the tradition of the Black education professoriate extends from a broader commitment in my research. And this is about a commitment to reconstructing our collective vision of the Black educational past. I now want to share a bit about my broader work in this area to emphasize how an appreciation for Dr. McAllister's work requires a broader reconceptualization of the role teachers played in every aspect of Black life over the course of the African American freedom struggle. And my desire for a new interpretation of African American education began with the textbook. I had come across a passing reference to Carter G. Woodson's textbooks, one of which you see pictured on the screen here being read by a group of junior high students in New Orleans during the 1930s. You know, before this period, I knew, and this is when I was in graduate school, I should say, when I started to think about these questions, but before then, I knew of Carter G. Woodson to be the famed historian, right, the child and student of formerly enslaved people, and that he was the second African American to receive a PhD in history from Harvard in 1912. I was also familiar with his most iconic book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Yet while I was familiar with these aspects of Woodson's intellectual contributions, the story of him writing textbooks from 1922 until 1950 and their wide circulation among black teachers posed a narrative problem for me. Because this story about this intellectual production by black educators challenged impoverished framings about African American education based on the historical scholarship documenting separate and unequal schooling before the landmark ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. And indeed, while the stories about separate and grossly unequal material resources were indeed factual, these histories only revealed part of the story. They failed to remember the art of black teaching, which I wrote about in my first book, a legacy represented by those very textbooks published by Carter G. Woodson. And I would also say the scholarship by folks like Thompson and McAllister as well, who were also teachers producing scholarship that would directly impact the work of black teachers. And while I was impressed with Woodson's individual contributions, I became mostly concerned with the tradition of teaching that he represented. And it was the story of one educator in particular that forced me to confront a broader social history of black teaching that made the intellectual labor of people like Professors Woodson and McAllister so impactful, right? What I'm saying is that these scholars are not just these individual people operating in a vacuum, but the intellectual ideas that they're pursuing and that they're expressing are coming from a much broader social context among black teachers that we have to appreciate in order to take their ideas seriously. And this teacher that I'm referring to, whose story I encountered that helped me see these things, is largely undetectable in traditional educational records, instead existing in otherwise places, requiring the assembly of new archives. I want to tell you just a little bit about her story as I move into the final parts of my comments. So Tessie McGee read to her class in a steady, measured tone, quietly engaging in a calculated act of subversion. She was black, 28 years old, and she taught history in 1933 at the only black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The all-white Department of Education and local school board gave very clear instructions. Teachers were to keep the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, which they were to follow closely to acquaint their students with the targeted learning objectives. Black educators and families in Webster Parish had little formal control over curriculum. Yet on many occasions, Ms. McGee made what she deemed to be necessary revisions to the mandatory curriculum. Based on her own judgment, and perhaps at the recommendation of fellow black teachers, she often read passages from Carter G. Woodson's Book on the Negro, which rested comfortably in her lap. She kept the textbook out of sight, understanding that if she were to be caught, she would be vulnerable to the disciplinary practices of Jim Crow authorities. But she was undeterred. One of Miss McGee's students from that year recounted, quote, "She read to us from that book. When the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk, and she began teaching us from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap," end quote. Tessie McGee's method of instruction constitutes a textbook example of what I came to call fugitive pedagogy. Fugitive pedagogy consists of African Americans' physical and intellectual acts that explicitly challenged anti-black protocols of educational domination. And these were actions that often took place in discreet or partially concealed fashion. And my use of this term fugitive draws inspiration from the historical archetype of the fugitive slave who emerged as what we might think of as a folk hero, and I'm taking this idea actually from Margaret Walker Alexander when she talks about folk heroes in the black intellectual tradition, but who emerged, these black fugitive slaves emerged as a folk hero in black curricular imaginations. Because as early as 1890, we see African American educators writing textbooks filled with heroic narratives about enslaved blacks who absconded from plantations, those who led slave revolts, and stories about maroon communities in the dismal swamps of Virginia, Suriname, Brazil, and Jamaica. And it was also clarifying to learn that the very first black authored textbooks were actually written by fugitive slaves. James W.C. Pennington, an escaped slave from Maryland, became a teacher in Connecticut, and he inaugurated this tradition in 1841 when he wrote a textbook of the origins and history of the colored people. And he wrote this textbook while serving as principal of the African Free School in Connecticut. And so what I'm saying is that, I'm carving this out because I want us to understand that black educators had always been more than just doers, right? Just practitioners, but they had always been scholars of the practice as well, even before they were able to earn doctoral degrees in education or any other field, right? So to appreciate the intellectual work of this, these scholars of black education studies requires an appreciation of this much longer intellectual tradition. And so my conceptualization of this idea of fugitive pedagogy is essentially naming a phenomenon that surfaced in the archive at multiple levels, right? I'm trying to say here that this is much more than just an elaborate metaphor, but the concept draws a narrative line from enslaved people's defiance of anti-literacy laws that criminalize black education, right? Anti-literacy laws like those passed in Mississippi, Virginia, South Carolina that made it illegal for black people to learn to read and write during slavery, such that we have testimonies from formerly enslaved people like Mandy Jones from Mississippi, who talks about black people climbing into pits in the ground to learn to read and write, right? What I'm saying is that there is a connection between that subversive history of black teaching during the period of enslavement among fugitive slaves and the fugitive literacy of enslaved people. There's a connection to that and the work of teachers like Tessie McGee, who are operating at a time, even when black education is technically legal, even though we know that black teachers in schools continue to be met by violent white resistance, right? And we know this because between 1866 and 1876, more than 630 black schools are burned down across the southern states, which is what requires black teachers to engage in these kind of subversive practices. And I think it's important to note that fugitive pedagogy was a collective endeavor, even when manifesting as individual acts of practice. For instance, the principal entering Miss McGee's classroom was a black man named J.L. Jones. And records suggest that Principal Jones actually supported the inclusion of black history and culture at the Webster Parish Training School. How do we know this? Well, we know this because when we look to the records of the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, the principal was listed as an executive council member of the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, an organization that explicitly endorsed Carter G. Woodson and his work during this time period. And you can't make out the text on the screen, but this is just one article where the work at the school that Tessie McGee works at and the principal is being highlighted for the local organizing work that they're doing in raising money to offer matching funds to for the Rosenwald Foundation to modernize their school building, a practice that we would see happening across the southern states. But we also know that Woodson was a leading member in the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, but also black teacher associations across the country, because he regularly appeared on programs at the annual meetings of these organizations at both the state and national level. Right? We see this with Woodson's life membership card in what was formerly the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools, but also one of many newspaper clippings where he's appearing. This one is from the state of Tennessee, but there's appearances of him in the documents from the organizations in Mississippi, Texas, all across the states that had these organizations. So I'm offering this to say that given this context, it is not implausible then to consider that Principal Jones and Miss McGee may have very likely conspired together. The principal testing the teacher to ensure she could protect herself and the school if a white official entered the room, because black educators walked a tightrope when challenging such oppressive schooling contexts. If they were to fall or be caught, there was no safety net to catch them. So what do I mean by this? Just a few years prior, the white school board in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which was heavily influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, I should say, they had learned that Carter G. Woodson's textbooks were being used in the local black high school. And when this happened, the books were confiscated, the teachers were reprimanded, and the principal's life was threatened, and he was forced to resign and leave town. And examples of this kind of violent oversight are plentiful, and they move forward and backwards in time as far as black teachers are concerned. African American educators were routinely targeted and fired for challenging the authority of Jim Crow school officials. Some notable examples of this being Ida B. Wells, who many may know as for her important activism with the anti-lynching kind of activism, but also her work as a journalist and her work in helping to found the NAACP. But you know, Ida B. Wells was a public school teacher in Memphis, Tennessee, and she was fired in the 1890s after she had been exposing, through her local kind of journalism, the exposing the manipulation or in the exploitation of black women school teachers in the public schools by white school officials. But also John W. Davison, who was fired from a school that he founded in Georgia in the early 1900s, not for teaching Negro history, but actually for teaching Latin, right? At a time when liberal arts education was deemed inappropriate for black schools during the time period. Anna Julia Cooper, who's demoted as the principal of the M Street School in Washington, D.C., at a time when this school is outperforming local, white schools in the area, but also after she had recently invited W.B. Du Bois to come and be a speaker at the school. Again, seeing this connection between black teachers and the black intellectual elite. Some of them teachers themselves, but also people like McAllister, Woodson, and Du Bois being a part of these folks that black teachers are bringing into schools. But also the iconic case of Septima Clark, who we know is fired because of her refusal to conceal her involvement with local political organizing, and particularly the NAACP, at a time when it was illegal for public school teachers to be members of the NAACP. And it's important to note that there were some teachers who lost more than their jobs. Harry and Harriet Moore were fired in 1946 for doing exactly what Professor Jane McAllister encouraged teachers to do, was to organize, to put pressure locally to achieve salary equalization between white and black teachers, right? These are things that she found in her study in Louisiana, and these are things that black teachers organized around as policy points that were important for the work that they were doing. Harry and Harriet Moore were leading educators in Florida doing some of this work, and they were fired in 1946 and then later killed when their home was bombed in Mims, Florida on the same date as their wedding anniversary in 1951. I'm sharing this to say that black teachers' awareness of such stories prompted them at times to conceal the work they were doing in the classrooms and in their communities, even as they developed strategies to contest this violent reality. For instance, teachers were, like Miss McGee, were connected through what the sociologist Alden Morris has come to call insurgent intellectual networks. And these were institutions like Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, but especially, what I've been trying to emphasize, this especially was represented by colored teachers associations, in which, Professor McAllister was a leading member and an important intellectual figure. Such organizations comprised a veiled yet networked black educational world, right? This document, again, you can't make out the text, but I'll just tell you, this is also from the state of Louisiana in 1935. And this list with the document in the middle is a listing of teachers by grade level across the state who are organizing themselves into study groups to read new literature by black writers and black historians as they're studying this information to figure out how to infuse their curriculum with this information, even as it's not formally adopted or accepted by local white school boards. And it was in these spaces that the scholarship of leading thinkers among the black education professoriate helped shape the agenda of Colored Teachers Association. Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister was certainly among them. Not only does Dr. McAllister appear on the programs of Colored Teacher Association meetings across the country, or in profiles about her leadership in summer schools for black educators, but there are also moments when the findings of Professor McAllister's scholarship are used to shape the collective political goals of CTA membership. For instance, in 1931, Fannie C. Williams, who was then the president of the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools, circulated a message to be read to various state memberships. In citing Dr. McAllister, President Williams identified primary policy objectives of the NATCS, identifying key areas to be the quote, problem of better trained teachers, longer school terms, better school attendance, better equipped buildings, more efficient supervision, and adequate salary schedule, end quote. Williams then goes on to urge the various bodies to develop, quote, a state research committee, and that these bodies should follow the lead of Dr. McAllister in carrying out local research, end quote. The thought leadership of Dr. McAllister could also be found beyond the state of Mississippi. For instance, in 1937, one finds teachers in Louisiana organizing themselves into special committees based on Professor Jane McAllister's course syllabus on modern methods in rural teaching. So in short, colored teachers associations formed a black counter public sphere, an intellectual space where the professional black teachers engaged with intellectual resources produced by black scholars as they organized against forces of domination that fringed on their dignity as educators. And when writing my first book, it was during that period that I decided that I wanted to search out and seek out more of these records of Colored Teachers Association. And at that time is because I wanted to try to trace and track this connection between black scholars and the work that black teachers were doing on the ground. However, locating these materials proved more challenging than expected. What I found after traveling to more than a dozen states in Washington, D.C. was deeply concerning. Some of the records were cataloged and easy to access, but the great majority of them were unprocessed or existed in bits and pieces scattered across multiple historical repositories and personal collections. Sometimes I was told the materials did not exist after driving from New Orleans to Jackson, Mississippi on a hunch, only for a near complete collection to later be discovered in an old plastic bin in a closet. Sometimes the journals of colored teacher associations sat on shelves in libraries as ordinary reference material, despite their fragility, as you can see from this photo, and their historical significance. So recognizing the disorderly nature of this archive, I decided that my work as a scholar included the custodial task of securing the long-term preservation of these collections to insist that an archive remains for subsequent generations of scholars who will exceed my work and indeed my lifetime. So since 2018, I've been building the Black Teacher Archive, which entails locating, cataloging, and digitizing the serial journals and publications of colored teachers associations. And I don't know if the QR code comes up. If not, I can make sure we circulate it. But it'll take you to the online digital repository. It doesn't require any kind of credentials, no kind of university credentials, but it's open access to anyone who goes to the online collection. This digital archive officially launched in October 2023, and it is an open access online portal. And to date, the Black Teacher Archive is the largest digital repository of material on African American teachers and education. This online collection consists of more than 50,000 pages of written material by African American educators and scholars of education during the Jim Crow era. And in the pages of these journals, we see a likeness, not only of an intricate world of black school teachers, but also of their careful collaboration with the black education professoriate. We see a more fluid vision of black education, one where the work of educating African American communities is both a scholarly project and a matter of practice deeply connected to the spiritual striving of a people. The image of black educators revealed in these records offers a much more robust vision of what it means to be an educator, not only for a black educator, but any educator committed to the highest aims of the vocation of teaching. And while the records of the Black Teacher Archive can help achieve thicker descriptions about the contributions of scholars like Woodson and McAllister, this is only the tip of the iceberg. Because when gathered together, these artifacts become much more than just a collection of past material, but instead an anticipation for a collective memory to awaken. And as a final part to kind of wrap up my comments, I actually just want to turn over to a very short trailer about the Black Teacher Archive that gives you a sense of what the collection entails and why it's important for contextualizing the work of folks like Dr. McAllister, but also the broader professional world of Black teachers and their contributions.
We've been missing a very, very important part of the Black freedom struggle by not including teachers front and center in that story and elevating the work of educators when it comes to Black collective struggle. The Black Teacher Archive is this digital portal that houses the records of colored teacher associations, particularly their journals. These are digital representations of these physical materials that exist all over the country.
We're trying to provide a different form of access and also honor the care that has already been provided to the material.
We're taking advantage of what it means to live in the digital age, and with the hopes of kind of revitalizing some aspects of tradition, but also to say there are things that we can do now that couldn't be done 20 or 30 years ago in terms of digitizing.
One of the most important things that can happen is that allows us to tell much more robust stories about the role that teachers played in all aspects of Black life.
When people think about the civil rights movement, teachers are not necessarily the people that come to mind. There are all these individual figures, but then when you sit back and wonder, well, where did all of these great and important leaders come from? When we think about their oratorical skills, right? When we think about their ability to imagine a world outside of the confines of Jim Crow, where did they learn that?
Despite the extraordinary blooming that has happened in African American studies, we are still mining for the stuff of the tradition that we need to do to fashion, shape the field, to tell the story. I do think that this project is yielding a lot of gold.
Okay, and that's it. Thank you so much for your attention and engagement. And I'm gonna turn over to the moderator. Do we have time for some questions or no?
We got, yeah. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take a break because we're gonna bring Dr. Givens and the rest of the panelists back for the question and answer at the end of the next section.
Okay, got it.
And in the meantime, anyone that wants to ask questions, we can give you these so you can write your questions down.
Perfect.
Because we don't want you to lose sight of what you want to ask Dr. Givens.
There we go. All right, thank you so much. All right.
So let's prepare for the next panel.
All right. Thanks. Oh.
If you have evaluation,
I'm not worried about it, but I'm just.
It's like in terms of social status, but not material. And I think that some of that is, yeah. multiple jobs sometimes. Also working with good hands as well sometimes. It's like,
Yes.
which is why we do worry about, you bring black people, so I read that stuff, and I'm just like, this is fascinating.
My slides from this laptop, or is this his laptop? Do you know?
Yes, I know that.
Let me see if I can get to it.
I don't know.
from here.
I don't know anything.
Uh-oh. Hopefully I don't mess something up here.
Thanks. I'm gonna have to Jack at one point.
Oh, okay, got it, yeah. I'm gonna be heading out to work, I'm flying out today too.
Just ended it out.
Yeah, well, I got in this about to do something, do something in, I'm passing through Atlanta, but you can do something there. Yeah, so that's why.
Well, it's good to see you.
See you as well.
And I hope
Yeah,
to see you next time I'm in Boston.
Yep.
Probably get there in January.
Oh, okay, got, well, I actually be heading out, I just found I got a fellowship, so I'm gonna finally get in some time off to go do some writing. I'll be abroad, I'll be in London at this, I got a called the Legal Human Fellowship. Yeah. So it's a visiting professorship at the University College London, and I'll be there for the State of the Americas, trying to finish up the project. Yeah, so, and that's in the beginning of January, I might be there.
Yeah, I have to have the work room.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, who are you working with that weekend?
I'm working with Cobra.
Okay. I know Rachel Marks is who I work with. But cool, how are you experiencing? How's the experience doing? Great. Okay. Great. Yeah. Good to see you. Good to see you too. Yes. You said we're strangely on time? Well, maybe I hope to think up some time. Oh, okay. Yeah. That's the sign time. Sign back or down? Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah, so you would have to do that, right?
Oh, I wish I had access to some of those old student teacher association programs, so thank you. Yeah, I did film, I don't know if you did.
I wasn't there last time, but I heard pretty good.
Yeah, I'm gonna show the first 5 minutes as a clip. But, you know, And I'm going to talk about working in archives. You know, as you know, it's frustrating. But when you hit on something, it's just joyous. You know, I've got a couple of those experiences in the archivist at Talladega. He's going to be streaming. And he provided me with some material that was just invaluable. I'm going to talk about that.
Oh, maybe somebody thinks let me use a computer too. Yeah. I appreciate that. I was happy to kind of get like, I think this is, I can figure out a way to make these things. I got a stack of the black stuff around the black education because that's what I've been thinking about. Like, it's spoken about, but I think it's every time I'm teaching like black folks in it's their own history. Like, you know, this thing, folks doing this for a while, like, you know, it's like, but not really taking stock of like that tradition. Part because being in these folks didn't have the benefit of being able to kind of like publish a lot of their work because they were on the teaching, and the teaching was but their skills and research, and all of them didn't have the opportunity to like publish their studies and stuff like that. But they were still doing a lot of important intellectual labor that. One for the woman on the word. Yeah, that word. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's like all there, because it's all there. We just haven't been, for whatever reason. I think part of it has to do with the fact that kind of the social value, contemporary moment that we have of teachers, which is a reflection of some backwardness in our own kind of cultural context of the society that we live in that teachers does not value. And some part of what people do as valuable for like recovery and thinking about it, like looking to as lawyers and like important scientists for like all that stuff is great. But all
session 2, which is the final session. Our panelists will be discussing legacy and continuity and challenging minds, changing lives, sustaining. The panelists are Dr. Deirdre Wheaton, Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies and Interim Director of School of Lifelong Learning, Jackson State University. Dr. Doris Ginn, Associate Professor of Linguistics and Coordinator of Linguistics and English as a Second Language. Research included bilingualism, history of diaspora, and African American dialects. Jackson State University, retired, and also a former student of Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister. We also have Dr. Ivory Phillips, Professor of Social Science Education, Dean of the College of Education and Human Development, Jackson State University, retired, also a former student of Dr. Jane McAllister. Yes, we invite you up, panelists, to discuss this. Here they come, somewhere. Welcome. I think, where, so I guess you're going to want one after the other, right?
Yes. Yeah, one after the other.
Yeah, so would you like to sit here?
Have a plethora of screens up here this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to begin today with a quote. But it is a little bit unusual, the quote that I'm going to share.
Oh, it is turned up.
Okay.
You can get it closer, yeah. Or you can bring it.
Thank you.
Okay.
So as I reflected and listened to all the presentations that were given yesterday, and as I was preparing for this presentation, a passage of scripture actually came to my mind. So I want to share it with you this morning. It's from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and it simply reads, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then, neither he who planted is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, for we are God's fellow workers. According to the grace of God, which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it. But let each one take heed how he builds on it. This excerpt from 1 Corinthians chapter 3 came to my mind as I reflected on the enduring legacy of Dr. Jane McAllister. Although I have worked at Jackson State University for over 15 years, attended countless Founders Day convocations and various celebrations in the College of Education, and I walked the halls of the building daily, I really was not fully aware of the depth of the contributions of Dr. McAllister until I was invited to participate in this symposium. As I read about her trailblazing contributions, noted some of the parallels within our own educational journeys, both of us having made stops at the University of Michigan and Dillard University, and then ultimately at Jackson State University, these words from Paul seem very appropriate. She was indeed a master builder in the realm of teacher preparation, educational research, and educational advocacy and activism. she helped to lay a foundation upon which others have built. This morning, I'm going to share with you just a few of the ways in which the faculty, staff, and students in the College of Education at Jackson State are building upon this foundation that was laid so many years ago. But I'm not only going to share with you the great things that are happening at Jackson State in education. I'm also going to invite you to grapple with me over some questions and some warnings for us as we think about and craft and envision or re-envision the future of teacher preparation at Jackson State. As our presenters from day one and this morning have shared, there are some serious things that we need to consider about how we prepare future teachers. Is there anything at all that is different about the curriculum in teacher prep at Jackson State than any other university in Mississippi? I would like to invite you to consider these questions with me today. So, to help me share this story of how Jackson State is building upon this foundation of educational excellence, I'm going to share with you access to our inaugural issue of Elevate Education. This magazine is one that was launched this year, and the purpose of the magazine really is to talk a little bit about, with our students, with our faculty, and with our stakeholders, what is happening in education at Jackson State. So there are a couple different ways in which you can access this. If you have your phones, you can unlock the issue by scanning this QR code. Let's test it out and see if it works. All right. If you are able to scan the QR code, it should take you to a flip book to get the magazine. All right. Does that work for anybody? Raise your hands. Yes? Excellent. So now, if it doesn't work for you, you can also just go directly to the College of Education's website, jsums.edu/education. And the cover of the mag is on the website. You can simply double click on the cover and it'll take you to the magazine. Okay? So what I'm going to do this morning is just kind of talk to you a little bit about some of the key things that are included in this magazine. The first one that you see here in the New Directions in Education is that we currently have an interim dean of education. So that means that right now, probably actually next week, we're going to be doing interviews to identify a permanent dean. That's a big deal, as I'm sure you can imagine. But our interim dean really hit the ground running and is setting a vision for the College of Ed to be a hub for strategic collaborations, research, evaluation, professional development, and excellence in teacher preparation. This magazine, as I mentioned, is one of those ideas. Like, how do we brand and help others know what's happening and what we're doing at JSU? Now, one of the most important things that I think is important about this is our approach to preparing excellent teacher educators is to engage students in co-curricular professional development. So this year, we launched what we refer to as Teaching Tuesdays. So these are days during which our education majors connect with organizations in the city of Jackson to find opportunities for them to volunteer, to go into local schools, to tutor, and many of these are both volunteer and paid tutoring positions that students can take advantage of. Additionally, on these Teaching Tuesdays, our juniors and seniors who are preparing to do their clinical internships have an opportunity to get professional development directly from trainers at the Mississippi Department of Education. So they come to campus and help train our teacher candidates to prepare for their first clinical internships. So now, if you jump ahead in the magazine over to page 17, there are a few new initiatives. Innovative education collaborations. One of the new initiatives that we are most excited about is what's called the Count Me In Future Teachers of Math Education. This collaboration is between Jackson State, Jackson Public Schools, and the Mississippi Department of Education. What we have done is developed a geometry and algebra focused math education major. MDE approved it last year, and we now have our first 2 cohorts of students who are in a dual enrollment program to become math education teachers. So what this means is that there are juniors and seniors from schools across Jackson Public School District who, while they are finishing up their junior and senior year of high school, they are also completing their freshman and sophomore year of their math education curriculum at Jackson State. So we have 14 students in cohort 1 and 17 in cohort 2. What these students get access to is a reduced tuition rate at Jackson State during those first 2 years. They get a full academic scholarship for the last 2 years of their experience, and they make a commitment to teaching in a JPS school for at least 3 years after graduation. So we think that this is an excellent grow your own program that is indicative of the type of collaborations that help to address teacher shortages in our schools in the district. But more importantly, I think is probably one of the things that the students have indicated that they appreciate most is that as these students are being trained in their math content area, they're also getting really unique opportunities to learn about math pedagogy. This past summer, they received a full week of training with instructors from the Southern Initiative Algebra Project. So they're learning about creative ways of connecting and helping students learn math concepts. They were able to also use those skills to help a group of students in our Continuing Education Learning Center. So high school students who did not complete the traditional path to a diploma, who are working on their GED, they did a week-long session where they provided a math boot camp for students who are working on their GED. And I think that was one of the experiences that they said they liked the most about having an opportunity to help those students get prepared for the GED. This is one of those, I think, examples of how we are helping these students not just learn math content, but really see themselves as vital and important to the work of education in the city of Jackson. Skip ahead with me to page 20. In addition to math education, we were also recently the recipients of a grant through the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards to help integrate these standards throughout our undergraduate and graduate curriculum. So we have National Board certified teachers who are working with our university faculty to integrate these standards into our regular curriculum, our taught curriculum. Additionally, our SEED project facilitators come to campus on those Teaching Tuesdays or Training Thursdays, and they help our students to talk about and get prepared for their clinical internships. One of the specific programs that they are working on now, that we're working on developing, is a mentoring group, so that when these students go into their schools for the first time, they have a learning community that they connect with of fellow students, but also these National Board certified teachers who help them troubleshoot and address issues or challenges that they face in the classroom. So we're giving them not only curricular changes, but also co-curricular and outside of the classroom mentoring and training as they're preparing for their first year of teaching. Let's see. We have just welcomed or added on a new director of our Center for Teacher Ed, Mr. Mosey, who has also taught in the Jackson Public School District and is a native of Jackson. On the research side of things, the students who are part of our dual enrollment math program are also integral to the piloting of a math education research center that's being piloted at Jackson State in collaboration with the university or with Virginia State University. And essentially what we're doing is engaging with VSU and a couple of other HBCUs to explore what it looks like to have housed at HBCUs a math or STEM education research center, with the goal of making sure that there are no failing schools within 10 to 20 mile radius of all HBCUs. It's one of the things that we're working toward. So these initiatives are just a few of the key things that are happening in education at Jackson State. If you care to do so, you can flip ahead to the section called Education News this has some additional key things that are happening in the college, one of which we're very proud of. Last year, Jackson State was named the only school in Mississippi to receive an A+ for literacy for our science of reading work that our faculty are doing there, the only one of all the universities. So we're very excited about that. All of these great things that are happening in the College of Ed are important, right? They're essential. They speak to the fact that the things that were important to scholars like Dr. McAllister are still very important to those of us who are working at Jackson State now. But if I'm very honest, this building that we're doing is somewhat serendipitous, right? It really was not done with an intentional focus or emphasis on connecting to the histories and the legacies of the people who came before. So as I grappled with that fact, right, with an honest assessment of what we have done and how we may not have been as effective as we could have been in creating connections between our past and our present and where we're going for the future, this is what makes me heed that warning in that scripture that Paul said, that we should take heed to how we are building. And so there are a few things that I have in my role, both as a director and as interim associate dean. I think that there are some very specific things that we can do to create classroom teachers and cultivate an environment for teacher preparation that intentionally links to our history and the legacy of scholars like Dr. McAllister. A few of them are already in the works. We are preparing to adjust our general ed curriculum to include an education, equity, and inclusion pathway. So that means that students have the option of building into their gen ed curriculum courses that focus on the history of education. Additionally, I think we need to integrate Black educational history and attention to anti-Blackness into our taught curriculum. If I were to ask you right now to use your phones to look at the curriculum for teacher prep at Jackson State and to look at the curriculum for teacher prep at USM or Mississippi State or Ole Miss, I'm not know if you'd be surprised by this or not, but they are exactly the same, right? Students take exactly the same coursework. A lot of that is prescribed by MDE, but the reality is that the majority of the teachers that we prepare and the schools that they go into requires that they be equipped and educated and trained with very specific, I think, with different insights and outlooks. And giving some attention to anti-racism in our curriculum for teacher prep, I think is essential for how we move forward. Building the educational trailblazers from the college into our branding, I think is also part of that, that effort. Including reading clubs, right? Book clubs that focus on reading some of the books like Fugitive Pedagogies and Anti-Blackness in the Classroom, I think is essential to helping to elevate education in more meaningful ways. Seeking funding to support summer education research projects where students really get an opportunity to understand the art of Black teaching, right? I think is essential to how we move forward. The reality is that even as we prepare teachers for their licensure examinations and prepare them to understand how to use data to make decisions, the foundation upon which we really need to keep them connected is that there is a legacy of effective and passionate and activism-oriented educators that they need to be aware of. And at present, our curriculum does not take that into consideration in the way that it should. So, as I kind of bring my comments to a close, I really do believe that there are ways in which we can do things to leverage the collective wisdom and experiences of prior educators, especially those who are directly connected to Jackson State. As the editor of Elevate Education, I can tell you that one thing we will be doing moving forward is including a new section in the magazine called Education Trailblazers. But we will be highlighting and featuring people like Dr. McAllister and including book reviews of new books like the two that have been featured here today, so that students are very well aware of things that they should be reading and made aware of just as professional educators. And I'll close today just by saying that as I think about where we have been, where we are right now, and where we are going in the future, the image of the three soldiers from the Civil War keeps resonating with me. There was one soldier looking behind him, there was one soldier looking forward, and both of them were helping to carry the soldier who was in the middle. And so as we are doing the work that we do to help carry and nurture and cultivate the next generation of teachers, there is a need both for a looking back at those foundations and a looking forward at new directions. So I thank you all for allowing me some time to share what we're doing at JSU and look forward to the conversation that is to come as my colleagues from Jackson State share a little bit about what it was like to have been students of Dr. Jane McAllister. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Wheaton. I'm not sure. Okay, so next is Dr. Doris Ginn, former student of Dr. McAllister. So, welcome. Thank you.
Her personal email's up, so.
Oh.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hope all is well today. We are, the School of Education just did its part. I'm a product of Jackson State, the School of Education, as a teacher. And those years were satisfied from those in the School of Education who trained us to be the best of teachers. I consider myself as a stalwart teacher with a lot of experience. And I see my students all around and friends all around, and that makes me proud. So I'm happy today and honored to talk about one of those faculty persons who taught me at Jackson State in the name of Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister. She was a person to be reckoned with. In 1951, Dr. McAllister arrived on Jackson State College's campus in Jackson, Mississippi. The college motto at that time was, "The whole individual learning teaching." Those were the days when teaching was the ultimate education Black students could achieve for a college degree. Times were segregated and limited visions stacked the curricula and academic vision for all Blacks. But Dr. McAllister did not allow those restrictions to stymie her fortitude for the diversity of challenges she had waiting for the disadvantaged youth under her tutelage. She became avant-garde for perpetuating a challenge of scholarship. Her teaching philosophy, engulfed by the Socratic method, existed as a thunderbolt of knowledge to her students as they sat in awe, full of dismay and disbelief of such a teacher. Many felt they were being taught by a white teacher who was bona fide crazy. We had never encountered a teacher with such strong Caucasian features. Neither had we as country children experienced such high energy and enthusiasm in a classroom teacher. We were zonked. Most of us had come from environments where academic motivation was not laced with fear and undaunted challenges. We never had assignments where whole book chapters were read for the next class period. Dr. McAllister's objective was to have the entire textbook read by the end of that quarter. Students could not fudge on reading the assignment because Dr. McAllister would call you out. No student wanted that embarrassment. She knew every student by name, and you could not get by. Oh no, you had better not be absent to avoid skipping the homework or to imply that you were unprepared for that day. Class pacing was very high and full of academic tension. Once class rules were laid and class was dismissed on her first day, there was much complaining and bashing as we walked down the hall. But we would show up the next day, ready but scared as jackrabbits. We never knew what was coming next. One classmate said, "I ain't never read more than one chapter in a night, let alone a whole book for a class before the end of the term." That was McAllister's academic challenge. She always encouraged having serendipity. That was her favorite word. We didn't know how to pronounce it, neither did we know how to spell it. Serendipity! She would yell out in her classes. We knew her as the epitome of her embedded legacy and scholarship continuity. Her vision for us as developing scholars was grounded in sustaining the legacy captured in Jackson State University's current motto of challenging minds and changing lives. Keeping the continuity of the past motto, the whole individual learning, teaching. So today, as we gather here for this inaugural conference as a tributary honor to Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister, it is altogether fitting and proper that we acknowledge her 125th birthday posthumously as we celebrated yesterday, October 24th. That life and legacy represented an icon of intellectualism and purpose in her city of birth, in the cultural environment of her rich academic foundation that propelled her to being first in many aspects of leadership, academia, and socialization. That was her legacy, marked by serendipity. Her challenge to us, the underexposed, culturally limited, was symbolically like a candle which consumes itself to light the way for others. That she did. Her student workers knew her as a thinker because she believed in being the best in everything. She was often seen writing notes on brown paper bags or on any open sheet she saw available. Her main objective was to establish excellence. That was her goal set for each student. She once challenged one of her male student worker, and she said to him with this lifelong sentence, she said, "There is one thing that cannot be taken from you. That is education." That male student was motivated to excellence in his college work and throughout all future aspects of his life. Coming from rural Satasha near Yazoo City, Mississippi, Some of you know where that is.
It's very rural.
Coming from rural Satasha, this was Henry George Johnson, who became JSU's first graduate in chemistry. He was in a program she developed, the college readiness program that you heard about on last evening. He taught school for 6 years before becoming a technical sales representative in the corporate arena. He eventually became the national sales manager, traveling globally to more than 17 different countries. Remembering Dr. McAllister's challenge, he put serendipity to work for him in his quest for excellence and worked the corporate circuit for 47 years. He, giving all credit to Dr. McAllister's influence, as he worked in her office as a college student, being exposed to all that was great in her life. Dr. McAllister shared exposure and challenges became a profound demonstration of change for students in all circles that she created and operated and expanded throughout the 50s and 60s. As legacy to her own life, with both parents having been educated at Jackson State, she proudly continued with perseverance her service to uplift, educate, and expose the disadvantaged. She became the insurmountable candle guiding the minds of black men and women by giving the soul of her knowledge from within all her life experiences. We are the proteges of her influence. She was our candle, standing before us, lighting our ways with challenges, fears, anxieties, confidence, and pathways in schools and colleges of Washington, D.C., Louisiana, and Mississippi. I must tell you of one incident, since we're dealing with the 50s and 60s. There was a young man who was a veteran who was returning to school. Therefore, he was 2 years behind. His sister was in McAllister's class. McAllister had the philosophy of locking the door after the bell rang. You did not come in McAllister's class after that door was locked. This young man knew McAllister's standards, and he appeared after the door locked. There he was. Now, mind you, if you know Jackson, he lived about 2 blocks from campus at the corner of Lynch and Valley Street. He knocked on her door. Oh, that's something you didn't do. You don't knock on McAllister's door. When I close it, that's it. She stopped her class, and at that time, the lesson in the book dealt with adolescence, and they were discussing adolescence. When she got to the door, there he was. Oh, Dr. McAllister, I got to come in, I got to come in. She said, young man, you're late. He said, but our cows got out this morning. Now, he lived on Valley Street. And Daddy wouldn't let me come to school until I got them in. His sister heard that fib in the class, and she burst in a roaring laughter. And Dr. McAllister turned, now that's adolescence. She's laughing. And you are telling me why you need to come into this class. She said, come in, young man. If you got your daddy's cows in, that was exactly what you were supposed to do. That was discipline. McAllister was making a point that in your life's learning, you must be disciplined. But the same thing was important to him, is that he knew she was going to lock him out, but I'm going anyway. And I must pause here to tell a story about a young man in my class. And as I looked around and listened to all of what others have said about McAllister, I didn't know so much of her had been absorbed in my life. The class ended at 9 o'clock. This young man came in at 10 minutes to 9. I stopped. I said, young man, do you know what time this class begins? Why are you late? Okay. Remember, we were talking about disadvantaged students. He had worked all night at McAllister's, at McDonald's. And he got to his room and couldn't go to sleep because his roommates were loud. So when I looked at him and he said, well, Dr. Gann, I'm late because I was drunk. I was startled. Here this freshman young man gonna tell his teacher he was drunk, the reason he didn't come to class, and he just started talking. I got drunk because I wanted to go to sleep. And when I woke up, it was time for your class, and I still came. I said, okay, young man, sit down. We'll deal with this afterwards. I gave him a good parental talk. 3 years later, I'm walking across campus, and I heard somebody shouting out my name, and oh, I don't like loudness. Oh, all across the campus. I heard him, but I was just too ashamed to look. He ran and caught up with me. He was just waving his hand. Dr. Gann, Dr. Gann. I said, what is it? He said, I'm gonna graduate. I'm gonna graduate. I said, oh, I'm so proud of you. He said, you remember, I came to your class drunk, but I got myself straight. He said, I'm gonna graduate. I dropped my head, gave him a hug, and you know, nowadays we can't hug them, but I hugged him and we rejoiced. I said, I'll be at graduation sitting there, clapping my hands for you to walk across that stage. So those are the kinds of things we deal with disadvantaged children who have to work, stay up all night, come to school. McAllister understood all of that. She brought all of that to us and had me and all others to understand such a thing. Her life's commitment began in this historic city, Vicksburg, Mississippi, where her quest for knowledge began through her parents. They met the challenges of deprived education and set out to compensate for that neglect. That example taught little Ellie the meaning of fortitude, determination, and tenacity. If it is not there, make it possible. That's what her daddy did. Her father's name was Richard, and he did exactly that for his children. He wanted the best for his children, so he made it possible by making a way through a roadblock. That roadblock was the hindrance of his children getting into college. They tutored their children at home to meet the qualifications for entering higher education. Living that candle before Ellie taught a lifelong lesson of determination that she passed on to her students throughout her 50-year career span in the classroom. Her motto to students, get an education. No one can take it away. Returning to her legacy of continuity at Jackson State College, Dr. McAllister worked in a cradle of disadvantaged youth and underexposed colleagues. She championed a new environment of exposure beyond the gates by engaging students, administrators, and the community in the new wave of serendipity. She was an innovator who exposed the community and its colleges to a life of diplomacy, cultural enrichment, and academic prowess. She used her life experiences to educate and to motivate her academic spaces by inviting national leaders and scholars to the campus as speakers and lecturers. She introduced the telelecture series to the Jackson College family, exposing national and international scholars and leaders to the underserved families and environments. She was the beacon of light for Jackson College. Every student who sat under her tutelage could never again say or be rural, rustic, nor disadvantaged after leaving her academic exposure. Dr. McAllister taught the total child, as the JSU motto projected, challenging minds and changing lives, an extension of its motto of the 50s and the 60s. The whole individual learning teaching. The word teaching has the embedded meaning, in all you do, let it be a lesson learned. A mission instilled into all of us by Dr. McAllister. Her classroom demeanor was Socratic in presentation. She taught the whole person. Everyone who entered had to be alert and active. Her persona was uplifting, energized, and provocative. Students learned vocabulary, got wisdom, got textbook knowledge, professionalism, academic presence, and confidence. That is what we learned just by being in an academic setting with Jane Ellen McAllister. If you came to her as a country bumpkin, you left as a polished sophisticate. Just her image and actions were lessons learned. Aside from seeing her pace the floor as she taught classes, one had to notice how big and fat her hands were. They were uniquely different, with plump fingers that stood out as she gestured and made professional points. We as students saw every detail because we were too afraid to be distracted by anything else other than McAllister. Students of Dr. McAllister's class represented the most talented to the least talented. Everyone left with a scholarship in lifelong lessons and academic preparedness. She made us profiles of discipline, excellence, leadership, scholarship, and commitment. That was her focus. Her full-time secretary for 4 years became our class valedictorian. Our class was very unique. We were the civil rights class on the campus, so we had a lot of dealings with Dr. McAllister. That full-time secretary was Clarice Clayton Johnson from Laura, Mississippi. In Dr. McAllister's office, she handled all letters and telephone calls to dignitaries, world leaders, and scholars. This experience of professionalism led her to becoming a model science teacher in her classroom, to later become an assistant principal in the Los Angeles, California Unified School District for 35 years. Another profile of success we find in McAllister's classroom is many of the students who went on to become leaders in academia or in some other phase of life. All who experienced the McAllister classroom learned how to become excellent in all things. Her classroom drive taught confidence over fear through tenacity and persistence for excellence. We can now all live in her shadows of excellence. Thanks to Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ginn. And next, Dr. Phillips, another student of Dr. McAllister.
Thank you very much. After having listened to Doris, who's also my classmate, I'm almost tempted to just say amen and be seated. But I know that you would then wonder what's my problem that I can articulate. Today, I'm going to look at about 18 points. Now, don't worry, because these 18 points are not going to be that long. Each one will be fairly short. But I sort of put them down to keep myself on track as I go through this. And today I'm wearing my activist hat more than my educator's hat. And I don't feel too bad about that, because I heard from Dr. Givens and Dr. Spencer that a good deal of what they do as educators is really activism. So, although they're younger than I am, I'm following their footsteps in this instance. I came to Jackson State in July of 1960. And that's when I met Dr. McAllister. I was fairly quiet, but I was inspired by the example that she gave. I was inspired by the dedication that she displayed. And to me, the more I learned about her, the more I realized you are not that smart after all. I'm learning more and more. And after those first few months in the college readiness programs, I was so impressed that I decided each summer I would come back and study the college readiness program all over again. So a lot of what I'm saying here is a result of studying the college readiness groups in 1960, which was mine, 61, 62, and 63. In order to sustain the vision of Dr. Alexander, it's really important that we know what she stood for, what she did, and what she would really be proud of having passed on. So let me just say then, as I describe Dr. McAllister, my first descriptor is that she was a reading teacher extraordinaire. A reading teacher extraordinaire. When we came to Jackson State College as students, all of us had to take standardized exams, and they looked at the scores. And then you were placed in a group based on those academic scores, a lot of it which had to do with reading. The further you were down the totem pole, the more likely you were to have one or two of her reading classes. And when I think about that and the effort that she put in order to bring these students up to the level where they needed to be in terms of speed and comprehension, I can't help but think about a few years back, the College Board decided that instead of having teachers engaging in that kind of activity, we ought to just set a score and leave those folks somewhere else because they obviously was not college material. That is not Jane Ellen McAllister. Jane Ellen McAllister looked out at those students and realized they had been shortchanged in their elementary, middle, and high school years. They had been deprived by their communities and even by the taxpayers of the state of Mississippi. Therefore, we have an obligation to reach down and get these students and help them to become the kind of scholars that Doris Gann just described. But she wasn't just interested in how swift your reading was or how comprehensive you were. She was also concerned about the quality of reading to which you were exposed. She didn't want you just to read the Clarion Ledger. She didn't want you just to listen to WJTV. Because she said, and one of her favorite words that I used to like was, because a lot of what's in there were written by nitwits. Yeah, a lot of it was by nitwits. And she wanted you to have the broad understanding of other people who were intelligent, intellectually and otherwise, out in the larger world. Her advice to us were, first read yourself full and then write yourself empty. First read yourself full and then write yourself empty. Now you could paraphrase it, because what she also wanted you to do was to expose yourself until you were full and then be able to discuss with other people intelligently until you're empty. That's the Dr. McAllister that I met in 1960 and was determined to try as fully as possible to carry on that legacy. Secondly, moving beyond the reading extraordinaire, I wanted to talk a little bit about the college readiness program. Not so much because I was a member of the first group of the college readiness program, but because as I looked out at that group, Dr. McAllister, you already know, was extremely brilliant. But in that college readiness program, she was associated with other people who were equally, well, I don't know if equally, but who were also brilliant. People like Dr. John Eubanks in social sciences and logic, Dr. Benjamin McLemore in math, Dr. V. Horatio Henry in social sciences, and Dr. Gloria Evans in speech and language arts. These were people at Jackson State that everybody looked up to because they knew how intellectual and how challenging these people were. This team formed the staff or the faculty for the college readiness program. We, as young, bright-eyed, and as Doris said, country children, were exposed to her and this group for 4 months. And we learned a great deal, not only of the subject matter, but about ourselves. It was a real challenge to us to become the kind of students that they expected us to become. As she indicated, this group brought the telelectures to Jackson State. We'd never heard of a telelecture before. We thought the teachers were to come in and you sit down and listen to what they, but these were teachers from around the world to whom we were exposed, because she wanted us to be exposed to the very best. This group brought to the campus advanced reading technology. Advanced reading technology. The reading technology that I had grown up with, brother, was a kerosene lamp right beside the bed. But we were exposed to reading technology that prompted and led you into how you could read more rapidly and with more comprehension. They brought to the campus a program that they called the Humanities Program. This was a course that deliberately united world history, world literature, music appreciation, art appreciation, and all the other humanities. And they did it period by period so you could understand an entire world order at that particular time and see how all these were related to one another. Dr. Eubanks had something that he called the integration of knowledge. And it was kind of funny to me because when I was growing up in Rosedale, nobody used the word integration because you could get into racial trouble. Now here we down here talking about the integration of knowledge and how important it is for us to integrate knowledge in order to become real active citizens out in the community. These were some trying times, but these were some exciting times. And I'm skipping through a little of this because I don't want to bore you to death, because Doris has already covered a great deal of it in a very excellent kind of way. But as I go through these and I think about it, and going back to that term sustaining, what I think about, in addition to sustaining the ability to read as opposed to turning folk out, we can help sustain it by making sure that the college board and all the other people who are in charge don't decide to write any parts of our communities off because they have not met some artificial standard that these groups thought that they should meet. We can sustain a lot of this, what's happening, by going back and realizing that a lot of the teachers that we have are teaching, but they're teaching with the handicap. The handicap being they were not exposed to the best, their classes are overloaded, they're not very well respected by the administrators and a lot of other people. So we need to sustain it by going back and making sure that they have the adequate kind of teacher preparation that Dr. Wheaton described. Making sure that these teachers are well compensated and well respected. Then students will pay them a lot more attention. But not only that, a lot of people who now decide they want to become a lawyer or an engineer or a physician because of the salaries, when in their hearts they could really be the very best kind of teachers if teachers were as well respected and well compensated. We need to take these kind of measures, and that's also what I meant when I said I'm putting on my activist hat more than my educator's hat, because these are the kind of things that we need to be active about out in the communities every day. They expose us to the very best kind of readings from around the world. So what does that say to us? We need to make sure that there are not people out there who are patrolling the schools and the libraries and banning books that students would otherwise learn from. We need to be able to sustain all of the stuff that these teachers taught us and be willing and ready to discuss. Now let me divert for just 1 minute. And this is not too much out of the character of Dr. McAllister, because I think it would be along with her principle of trying to eliminate people from being a nitwit. I just wanted to make a correction of something I heard yesterday, and that is regarding Campbell College. Campbell College did get started here in Vicksburg, right? And then Campbell College eventually moved to Jackson on Lynch Street. It was across the street from Jackson State. But Campbell did not become Jackson State. What happened during the mid-60s, Campbell College, along with Tougaloo College, was such hotbeds for political activism for black folks that the state of Mississippi put the squeeze on Campbell College, and it went out of existence. They sold the land to Jackson State University. For Jackson State's honor, I'm so proud that they thought enough of Campbell College and his political activism that they named 2 of their dormitories the Campbell Suites. That's the real truth about Jackson State and the Campbell College connection. So let's tuck that away and make sure, at least on that issue, we're not nitwits. Jackson State, Dr. McAllister was a fighter. And one of the things that I learned when I was in her class was that when she went off to grad school, she was trying to get into school, and the officials wanted her to go back and take a lot of remedial stuff before they would let her in as a full student. Dr. McAllister looked at him and said, "Give me the test." She demanded the test because she knew that she had the intellectual capacity. And then, because of her insistence, they had to give her the test, and she was fully admitted and had been flying ever since. We have to always make sure we stand up for ourselves, for our children, and for our neighbors, rather than allow somebody to put them in a box or a pigeonhole because they have a preconceived notion of what these students are like because of where they've come from. They point to the fact that she had gone to Talladega. Well, so what? Doris went to Jackson State. So don't write them off for those kind of reasons either. Dr. McAllister didn't want any of her students to ever be labeled as nitwits, such as some of our officials and our journalists and things were at the time. She spent her effort every day doing the kind of thing that Doris again just described to make sure that if you made an A here, you can make an A anywhere. She wanted to make sure that nobody ever thought that just because you went to Jackson State, just because you went to Valley, and just because you went to Alcorn, you are not intellectually capable. She spent a lot of time making sure that her students not only got their lesson, but to carry the message across the campus so that everybody at Jackson State, instead of running from her class, would try to get some exposure to her class. Now, I admit, the only class I took from her was as a college readiness student those 2 months. But I didn't really run from her class. It's just that I didn't have to have reading. But a lot of other students would have greatly benefited if they ran to her class rather than from her class. Finally, let me just point to 3 other things that Dr. McAllister was involved with that I think are important. One I've mentioned already, and that's the college readiness program. The college readiness program went out each summer and found about 30 to 35 students that they thought were capable of being really college students. But they knew because of their backgrounds in high school, they could not make it or they were not really ready. Dr. McAllister wrote that grant, and she was highly involved in it. She's the only teacher who taught in it all 4 years. Remember, I studied it and followed it for 4 years, but all 4 years she was involved. And although the students were often intimidated, she was the most highly appreciated and respected of the college readiness teachers. Secondly, some years later, she became involved in the 13 Colleges curriculum program, which was another one. It was based on the same kind of principle, and that is that a lot of black students were not doing well, not because of any problem of them themselves, but the kind of curriculum to which they were exposed. And in this case, I heard somebody use the term the other day when they talked about the culture deprivation. She knew that they were not culturally deprived. The problem was another culture was oppressing or omitting them from the table. The 13 Colleges curriculum program was designed to get a group of teachers to go out during the summer and study and revise that curriculum so that those curriculum reflected the same concepts, the same generalization, and the same structures as those at Ole Miss, at Harvard, or anywhere else. But the subject matter itself was based on their culture. So I remember one of the first courses I taught was a course called Social Institutions. And in social institutions, we looked at the concepts that are part of sociology. But what we did with that was to talk about the family, for an example. What are the purposes of the family? What do they do for people? The first example then we would give would be their families from Yazoo City, their families from Cleveland, Mississippi. Once they understood that, then we go out and look at families in America in general. We would look at the families in Israeli kibbutz. We would look at families in Russia. And then students could clearly understand each of the concepts because we started by talking about their culture, but it's the same concept you get in sociology wherever you go. That was the kind of thing that Dr. McAllister and her group also developed and spread for a while. Unfortunately, both the college readiness program and the 13 college curriculum programs were funded by outsiders. And anytime you have outside funding, there is a possibility that the funding can dry up or no longer be available. That marked the death of both of those two programs. The third thing that I would mention that I think Dr. McAllister would be proud of was the effort that was mounted in 1975, January. That's almost 50 years ago, right? At that time, a group of black plaintiffs filed a lawsuit entitled Ayers versus Waller. The purpose of that lawsuit was to go back and force the College Board to expend the same kind of money on Mississippi Valley State University that they were spending on Ole Miss. If and when that happened, you can attract a lot more scholarly teachers. If and when that happened, you can buy a lot better equipment and materials. If and when that happens, you can really restructure the curriculum in a much more effective way. That was 50 years ago. And this is another one of the cases where I'm putting this out there so that nobody from this room will leave as a nitwit. That lawsuit ended this fiscal year. And a lot of people are wondering, oh, I thought it was going to equalize Jackson State, Valley, and Alcorn with all of the others. But you can look out now and see there's no way you can compare Alcorn to the University of Southern Mississippi. There's no way that you can compare Jackson State to Ole Miss. And it's because as the suit was negotiated, settled, those three universities were shut out. And now, if you go back and look at what the settlement gave, even that is a false. It indicates that those three universities combined got an extra $503 million. But it's only 300 and some million, because they never raised the $34 million for the private endowment. You can't count the money that you pay to the lawyers. And just down the line, and you will realize that this was another of those failures. I'm saying all that again to say I put on my activist hat more than my educator's hat today, because a lot of times, in order for the educators to do what they need to do, the activists need to have done what they should have been doing. Because after all, I think when I was at the University of Washington, a guy came out with a book called Education as a Subversive Activity. Education, especially if you're talking about African Americans, has to be subversive. And what's that term you use, brother? Fugitive pedagogy? Yeah. There has to be that kind of effort if you're going to make a difference. As long as it looks like everybody's going along with everything, then you know for sure that in America, and especially in Mississippi, somebody's getting left behind. So let me close one last line, because I know the lady keeps saying, my time's about up. So as we look at Dr. McAllister's vision, we can, if not sustain her vision, her spirit, we can at least sustain that vision and give that vision added momentum if enough of us are creatively, intelligently, and courageous enough just to take up the mantle. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wish we had more time. Thank you, Dr. Phillips, Dr. Wheaton, and Dr. Ginn. And now we are going to see a 5-minute clip of David Ray Morris's film about Dr. McAllister. Come on.
I got to figure out how to get to this.
Oh, okay.
It's on the desktop. Okay, I got folks coming from both sides. It's on the desktop of this. Thank y'all. We had a screening of the film last night, and it was very well received, and I appreciate all who came. So I'm just going to show, this is just the, let's see, where is it? Yeah, new trailer. Right here. Yeah, that's it, should be. We have volume.
Let's see, just a second.
It should be it. But there's no audio right now.
Okay.
And if I have time, I'm going to tell you about this. This is the minor teachers college class of 1935. Actually, maybe we're not. Oh, wait. No,
That would
okay,
be
let me take it back.
the way that I measure myself.
Right.
Because
There we go.
one thing I would like to do would be to get some of the alumni who have achieved things, because I lived through the achievement of my students. I would like to summarize all of that and see how many have become physicians, how many who have contributed something to the world. If I could do that, that would be the way that I measure myself, because I had some small part in it, and their achievements that form a part of my life.
I think she had a tremendous impact on education. I don't know, 50 years later, how much of that is even known.
Dr. McAllister is important because she made a difference in the lives of a whole lot of people.
She is important as a scholar to have come and opened the eyes of little young black girls and boys from rural environments to see her as a black woman as a PhD. We had never been taught by a PhD.
One of the things that she advised us was, if you really want to be an effective teacher, you need to first read yourself full, and then you can write or teach yourself empty.
Living in her home in Vicksburg, even after retirement, she continued to write and to correspond and to be a leader in the black community and in the community at large. She is the emblem of what I think my life has aspired to, and so many others.
So you have to give her credit for having a clear understanding of the responsibility. Society is hard. Racism is not fair. But we can't sit around and cry about it. So what we got to do is make people tougher. Individuals got to work harder. You got to have this strong message. And teachers were the ones that were delivering that.
Jane Ellen McAllister was a pioneer in education. She taught generations and generations of aspiring black teachers when education was seen as the way up in the black community. She was a guiding light for scores and scores of people, including me. In many ways, I see myself as being one of her last students. I ended up writing my master's thesis on her at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Ginn talked about serendipity, which was Dr. McAllister's favorite word, and I very much describe that as being my relationship with her, because if I had taken a right on First Street North that day or gone straight down Main Street instead of turning left, when I spied an old black woman mowing the lawn in her flip-flops with a push mower, I never would have made the connection and never would have met her and never would have been inspired to research her and write my master's thesis on her. And in that regard, I want to talk briefly about working in the archives, because Dr. Givens talked about the passion and the frustration about working in archives. And all the scholars here and the writers can attest to sitting for hours and hours, going through folders and folders. Sometimes it's very mundane. You look up and you've been sitting there for 6 hours. And working in the archives, I'm a journalist, I'm a photographer, so it's been very joyous to me to work on this project in different archives. At Jackson State, Dorita Ballard is the current archivist. She was preceded by Bernice Bell, who was one of Dr. McAllister's students at Jackson State. And at UDC, Chris Abram, who provided me with a lot of material from Minor Teachers College. And Terry Trice at Talladega, who I think is streaming, so I want to give a shout out to Terry, who gave me some access to some of the old yearbooks that Dr. McAllister had, but we don't know what happened to them when she died. So working in archives has been a great joy. And one last thing I want to say about that opening picture is the 1935 graduating class from Minor Teachers College, and that's at the Smithsonian. And I found it in doing some research at the UDC archive. They had a book on the 160th